how children, it significantly impacts how children, parents, youth, and caregivers interact and communicate and respond with one another, and how they respond to conflict. So we're really, really pleased that the PD committee has considered and taken seriously the need to expand the knowledge as it relates to trauma and the theme of this incredibly important learning opportunity. So we are, Michael and I, very, very committed to not introducing slides that will create a trauma response to teach the concept. We're not into traumatizing others to teach about trauma. Some of the material may result in some trauma activations, and we really want to make sure that you take care of yourself. Remember the things that Amanda talked about, the breathe in. We're here for you. If you need to take some quiet time, camera off, step away from the screen for a moment, absolutely do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. So when it comes to trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution and child protection, as we've already mentioned, it really is the element, the core of the majority of the families that we work with in child protection. And if, as practitioners, we don't recognize the signs of trauma, such as disassociation, hyperarousal, heightened emotions, the person's ability to engage meaningfully in the process can become impaired, and it can result in conflict escalating rather than resolving it. And so clients who experience trauma can really have heightened sense of emotional responses. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it really is putting things into context. And so they may have difficulty trusting the process, and may struggle with open communication. Trauma can influence decision-making. It can lead to heightened stress. It can lead to avoidance behaviors, or even an inability to engage constructively. So, and the adversarial nature of disputes can trigger past trauma, making resolution quite difficult. So without a trauma-informed approach, alternative dispute resolution can actually escalate conflict rather than de-escalate and come to resolutions. As ADR professionals, we can also suffer from such exposure to trauma through vicarious trauma, which we'll talk more about later on this morning, due to repeated exposure to emotionally intense situations. And if not managed properly, we can become emotionally exhausted, and which can impair our ability to facilitate trust and engagement in an ADR process. So when we're looking at TI-ADR, stands for Trauma-Informed Alternative Dispute Resolution, and why are we looking at this? So understanding trauma in the context of alternative dispute resolution often arises from family violence, child abuse, and neglect, which is the majority of the families that we work with in child protection. These experiences affect individuals' behaviors and decision-making, and their ability to engage in the alternative dispute resolution process. Through a trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution process, we can focus on creating safe and supportive environments that recognize the emotional and psychological impacts of trauma, and really with the hope of not traumatizing further people who are already coming with some very deeply embedded emotions. In trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution, families have more control over the outcome. Instead of decisions being made by a judge or outside authority, they have a chance to really actively participate in crafting solutions. And this empowerment can be healing in and of itself, and can help families feel more capable of addressing the challenges that they face. So, part of this is looking at myths. right? And the myth is that trauma responses are solely psychological, and we're going to learn more today that it's not all psychological. It can be it can have physical impacts as well. And just because someone is not showing emotionally that they've been traumatized doesn't mean that there's not any trauma. And as it relates to the need for trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution, we have to try our best, and trying is the operative word there. We can't guarantee anything, but really to try our best to not re-traumatize individuals who are already taking a huge risk in coming to us. And the hope is that the approach will reduce harm by providing a more compassionate and supportive environment. Um, if we think about our clients as having gone through many challenges in their life where they may not have had control over the outcomes, and this process grants them that opportunity to have ownership over the next stages of their lives. And it's essential for all of us that are facilitators and that work in the field to really understand the underlying issues as it relates to trauma. And it's important to create an environment where participants can feel safe and empowered rather than pressured or coerced into reaching a solution.
So we also want to set the stage here and talk about trauma as a concept creep. And what we mean by that is that trauma is everywhere and it's everything. And by making it everything, it always has the risk of becoming nothing. Because when you have this horizontal um, uh, um, inflation of semantics around trauma concepts. What you end up with is now you're including more and more into the definition of trauma. And then you mix that with the vertical inclusion of concepts that are perhaps less extreme now become part of the extreme. And we need to be careful of how we define trauma and that we're not making everything trauma. But in terms of from a ADR perspective, we're also not trying to substantiate or validate somebody's trauma experiences. The fact that they may be experiencing a situation as being traumatic, that is their narrative, that is their experience. And we're not here to judge, we're here to be empathetic and sensitive. But it's also really important that we don't become um, we jaded because of this concept creep around trauma, where a lot of people now talk about trauma. A lot of people talk about trauma-informed practice, whatever that means. I reviewed a police report, for example, that mentioned the word trauma and trauma-informed over 200 times and never once defined it, never once really got at what they were trying to get at. And so defining our concept, defining our terms is really important for moving forward. One way of trying to differentiate trauma is to look at, what is good stress, what is not good stress, and when does stress become potentially traumatic. Some stress is actually good. We're finding that the idea of snow plowing for our children, where we take away all obstacles, is developmentally very challenging for them because they actually don't get to deal with stress. We have an anxious generation of teenagers and young adults now. It's to the point where the anxiety is being extremely debilitating for many youth. because they haven't had the opportunity to work through that stress, to work through that anxiety. And so some of that is good, but when it becomes toxic, when it becomes all encompassing, when it becomes prolonged, of an activation of stress, it can be really bad for individuals. It can be really bad for us. Think of your own work. I mean, if you can feel that you can make a difference and that you can deal with the stress, you can work around it, and you can do the self-care that Amanda was talking about, and feel good about this work, even though it's challenging. But if you start feeling that it is a prolonged activation without reprieve, without being able to be in a situation without stress, it can feel extremely traumatizing to you. So we're all probably familiar with the ACEs. These are Folletti and Company's 1990 ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, where they identify 10 specific indicators of previous childhood experiences that are considered to be adverse experiences. And then what's really impressive about this research is that they found both short and long-term impacts, both physically and mentally, if people have experienced these adverse childhood experiences. And if you add these up, then you actually see an increase in those negative impacts. And this can have an impact on strokes, on cancer, on relationships with others, on risky behaviors such as smoking and substance misuse. And so they're really important to consider. However, we don't want to get stuck in ACEs. I mean, it's also a really easy way of trying to understand trauma, but it's also misleading because it's so simple. And so we need to make sure that we're not just doing an adding up of the ACE scores and that becomes somebody's adversity, because one can have many ACE scores but still be quite resilient. We also want to make sure that we're not just focused on these 10, because it doesn't get at things like racism and poverty and location, geographical isolation. And those can also be very much adverse experiences for children. And so we don't want to emphasize these specific ones, because these were the big 10 that were studied. We don't want to pathologize. We don't want to use these ACEs to say what is wrong with you, and make that the starting point, where now we're looking at the pathologizing of the people we're working with as if there's something wrong with them because they've experienced trauma. What I like about the ACEs is that most people, at least 60% of people, have experienced at least one ACE. What does that tell us? It means that the majority of folks, on average, will have at least some adverse experience. So then we can normalize this. And so it opens the door for a trauma-informed approach, because it means that most of the people we're working with, most of ourselves, will have experienced some adverse experience, and therefore a trauma sensitivity and trauma informed practice approach makes a lot of sense, because it's going to ensure that we are being more sensitive. But at the same time, we also don't want to be pathologizing.
Pardon me. So when we think of trauma and defining trauma, um, one of the ways that it is defined is an emotional response to a terrible adverse event that some people have considered considerable difficulty overcoming. And it usually involves intense fear and complete loss of control that alters one's worldview. And typically, a situation that is considered traumatic is one when it overwhelms the person's ability to cope, causing significant distress and lasting emotional, psychological, or physical effects. Key factors can can make an experience more traumatic or can impact the trauma, such as the severity of the event, the person's personal vulnerability, the lack of control that a person may feel in the experience, whether there was a betrayal or a violation of trust or boundaries, which is the case for many of the families that we work with in child welfare. The duration of the situation or the repetitiveness of the situation, and trauma isn't always a direct physical injury. It can be emotional, psychological, as we all know with the clients that we work with. And people may respond to the same event in very different ways. What might be traumatic for one person may not be for another, and it depends on many individual factors in coping with. So types of trauma, there can be something that's a sudden occurrence, acute, unpredictable, such as natural disasters and accidents. Pardon me. These kinds of situations can have profound and long-lasting effects on individuals, communities, and societies. The trauma associated with these events often manifests itself both in physical and psychological ways. If there's a physical trauma, there can be the injuries that are sustained. It can be displacement that can lead to, loss of homes and livelihoods. It can be a death of a loved one that has occurred quite suddenly. Or our reaction to grief can be traumatic. Not all situations where there's a death are defined that way, but for some there are. Um, the repetitive trauma, which is chronic in nature, such as many of the families that we work with, where the child maltreatment and neglect has been pervasive. There can be human atrocities such as war and torture, and then there can be cultural trauma that we're just starting to learn more about the impact of colonialism and Indigenous peoples in residential schools, Holocaust survivors, Syrian refugees.
And just to add to that too, is that there's an intergenerational trauma experience. And so if my grandparent has gone through a traumatic event and that trauma is unresolved, I may not have gone through that traumatic event 2 generations later, but I will still be feeling the impact of that unresolved trauma because it gets passed down through parenting, through the emotional dysregulation, through the trauma experiences. And so one can be having the trauma symptoms even though they themselves have not gone through the actual traumatic event. And so if you look at residential schools, for example, and the intergenerational trauma, having a grandparent go through a residential traumatic experience, you see then how that can play out in generations to come. And so, the truth and reconciliation is really about dealing with that and then trying to resolve and reconcile those trauma experiences so that we can take in consideration the multiple generations that are impacted by these traumas. So I also want to just point out that when Vicky and I talk about trauma activation, we try and stay away from a word that I think is activating, which is trigger. It's a word that I just don't like using, and it has reference to a gun. And when you're talking about trauma informed, you want to use sensitive language. In the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges, JFCJ, it's an acronym I can never get right. I'm helping them develop a bench card for judges to help them better respond to trauma activation in the courts. And we've been really trying to have judges think about activation as being the point of intervention. And so when you try and prevent the activation by being more mindful and coming into those spaces, more aware of and being more intentional of how you're feeling and whether or not you're regulated and whether or not you're within that window of tolerance to be able to deal with the issues at hand. And then once you respond or once you're activated, then how do we as professionals help folks respond to those activations? And so people will take on these fight, flight, freeze, fawn. We've heard of these before. Perhaps fawn is maybe less known. This is when people try and appease. Rebecca Bailey from California is doing some really interesting work with people who've been abducted from their parents and then reunited sometimes 5, 10, 20 years later as young adults. And is really going against this idea of the Stockholm syndrome, which is a theory that's sort of been over time debunked that victims somehow align with their abusers, where she's looking at this notion of appeasement. It's not that one is being brainwashed to all of a sudden take on the role of the abuser, but it's more of a survival strategy to appease and to make pleasant and to fawn so that they're better protected in these times. And so it actually provides more agency for the victim of these abductions rather than further blaming them for being caught or trying to define or describe how and how they're somehow
Yes.
manipulated. And so these are really important notions to be considering is just how people are activated when they feel dysregulated, when they feel trauma is having a reaction in their bodies. And to me, somebody who has been looking at trauma-informed practice, whether it be mediation or policing or some of the work that I've done for trauma-informed coroner's work, I mean, it is very much applicable to all the work that we do in the courts and as mediators and as dispute resolution professionals and as child welfare professionals. Where I think this is the slide that I think is perhaps the most important of this morning. Because really what trauma-informed practice means to me is that it is looking at behaviors not as being problematized. We're not pathologizing those behaviors, but we're looking at those behaviors as being potential indicators of activation. So if somebody is getting angry, it may be that they're activated. Somebody is changing their positions or their stories. We assess their credibility because they're not able to tell a coherent story. And so we then say, well, we can't really trust you in your story because it's not linear, it's not coherent, you keep on lying, and therefore we don't think you're credible, and therefore we don't believe you. And this is the message that I think is really important to get across. What if they're not lying? What if they're actually activated? And that activation is having an impact on their ability to tell a story, that they're not able to tell a story from point A to point B to point C, but they're all over the map because of this trauma activation that is making everything in their mind flood. And what if we didn't then assess them on their credibility in this activated state, but we work at helping them to self-soothe and to co-regulate with them. So then we're not blaming them, but we're actually working with them in an organized way that looks at the trauma activation in a more sensitive way. And so when we see agitation and anxiety and anger and frustration and confabulation, which is very different than lying. Lying is when you purposely try and persuade, but when you're confabulating, it's like you're spinning your wheels. If you've been to a car accident, you don't remember all of the different events, and so you start confabulating, you start adding pieces to the story so it eventually makes sense. So confabulation and lying is two very different things. And we need to be thinking about these trauma activations and how they're having an impact on behaviors. So we're not blaming or shaming these folks for the activation, but we're actually being more sensitive to how they're presenting themselves.
So when we're looking at trauma-informed care, it really is an approach to provide care and services that acknowledges and responds to the impact of trauma on individuals. It emphasizes understanding, recognizing, and addressing the effects of trauma on people. And the primary goal of providing trauma-informed care is to avoid re-traumatizing individuals while promoting healing, safety, and empowerment. Um, and it's an approach that supports all the people that we work with, whether we know if there's a trauma history or not. We don't know everybody's background, and some are comfortable sharing, some are not, right? So we have to go in with the approach that we're supporting everyone that comes along our way. And we want to try to ensure that people affected by trauma are not further traumatized while receiving our services. Um, and understanding the potential impact of trauma in therapeutic settings and on therapeutic relationships. And I know Michael's going to talk a little bit more about the evidence-based research as it relates to trauma-informed care. Michael, are you going to do that?
Oh, you want me to do that right now?
Yeah, I thought you were. Sorry, or do you want to do it later? I thought that's where it was coming.
Oh
Sorry.
no, no, I can just touch on it. I mean, I think
Sure, sure.
one of the things we need to do. Sorry about that.
No
Um,
worries.
one of the things we need to do is differentiate between trauma-based therapies, so trauma-based CBT, for example, and then trauma-informed practices. Because trauma-informed practice is as much as an approach as it is specifically an intervention. And so we have a lot more research on trauma-based therapies. But here's some examples of trauma-informed courts and trauma-informed practices that are showing that if you were to be more sensitive towards trauma experiences, then you're going to end up with a more sensitive overall system to be able to be sensitive to the needs of the people that they're serving. I've been doing a research study with AFCC Ontario looking at trauma-informed courts, and we presented some of the findings at the last conference, and we're now writing up the results and then presenting the results for NCJ, FCJ in Boston in 2 weeks. And what we're finding from this evidence is that um, although people think, well, trauma, it's like, what do you do with it? I'm not a therapist. Is this really my role? If people can understand that it's not about therapy, that's a different type of trauma based programming. It's really about your position and how you approach this work. And if you're more sensitive to the potential activation of trauma in the spaces that you're in, with the people that you're in, then you're going to be much more effective in being able to address their needs.
Thank you, Michael. So the 4 R's of trauma-informed care, and I'll state what they are, and then I'll go into them a little bit more. So realizing, recognizing, responding, and resist re-traumatization. So as it relates to the realization, this involves recognizing the widespread impact of trauma and understanding how it affects individuals' behaviors, emotions, and physical health. And by recognizing that as professionals, it can influence, how we are involved with the families, and it helps with our approaches in trying to ensure empathy and awareness, and realizing the pervasive nature of trauma can really help shift the perspective from seeing certain behaviors as intentional or difficult to understand to seeing them as responses to past traumatic experiences. Um, the second one in terms of recognition, and this is the ability to recognize when an individual may be exhibiting signs of trauma. That outburst of anger, that outburst of rage, the tears, the quietness, looking off into space, they may all be symptoms of, or not symptoms, but signs that someone may be activated in their trauma. And they may be experiencing signs of anxiety, withdrawal, anger, as I mentioned, hyperactivity. All of those could be components of a trauma activation. Recognition helps also in how we can approach clients that might need some extra support. Because they're not always able to express what their struggles are directly. So understanding the behaviors and responses can indicate past trauma, can be very critical in your approach. In practice, it means that we need to be trained to look for signs of trauma in subtle or obvious ways, changes in moods, changes in body language, their ability to concentrate. This also involves being attuned to nonverbal cues, such as a person physically recoiling or seeming distant. The third step is how we respond. And responding is about creating an environment and a response that is shaped by an understanding of trauma. It involves adapting our services and practices and interactions to be sensitive to the needs of those who've been traumatized. Responding involves acting in ways that reflects an understanding of the trauma and its effects, and using sensitivity. As Michael already mentioned, it's shifting the focus from blame and shame to one of compassion and understanding. And then the final R is the resist the re-traumatization. And it's about doing our best. We can't guarantee it, but doing our best to try to help not re-traumatize individuals that are already deeply hurting. And even well-meaning interventions can sometimes unintentionally re-traumatize a person. Ensuring that our environment and our words and our actions are done through a lens of being trauma-informed. When all of these principles are applied together, the goal really is to create an environment where individuals have experienced trauma to feel safer, respected, and empowered.
So how do you feel right now? Perhaps you feel a little agitated because we're not going fast enough or we're going too slow, or perhaps you're wondering how much emails are piling up while you've been sitting here on the computer and you're wondering whether you're going to ever get your work done today. Perhaps you have a client that you need to meet with after today, and it's really stressing you out, and you feel that you're really feeling the stress of the situation. Siegel and the window of tolerance is a wonderful way of trying to think about trauma activation. And it does fit really well with neuroscience and what we know about the brain and how the brain reacts to trauma and how the brain reacts to stress. If I'm in a comfortable state, I have no reason to be distressed right now. I'm just talking to you all, spending time with Vicky, who I like a lot, and we spend a lot of time doing this. So it's very comfortable to be here in this space with you. I'm totally within my window of tolerance. It can be a little stressful to, to present, but generally it's not going to traumatize me as perhaps it may do for some if they're given the opportunity to present, which means that I can think from my prefrontal cortex. My amygdala has been soothed. I don't have an amygdala hijack. I don't have something that is occupying my trauma activation, and therefore I can think, I can tap into my memory, I can tap into my decision making, I can make good decisions while I'm in this space. If I become activated and I hyper or hypo arouse, then I may have what's called an amygdala hijack, which then fear, concern, worry jumps to the very front of my consciousness or unconsciousness, and then it starts directing my behaviors, my actions, my feelings. And so if I'm activated, I'm not going to be able to think through issues. When you have clients who come see you who are activated and you're saying to them, don't do this or don't do that, they're not listening to you because they're in a state of activation. Their prefrontal cortex actually shuts down when the amygdala is firing. And so we need to soothe the amygdala, soothe the activation. And only by soothing that activation, we then get the ability to start problem solving. And so we always want to do check-ins with folks, with ourselves, as Amanda did with ourselves when we first started off. We always want to do these check-ins with the clients we work with. How are you feeling today? Did you have breakfast? How did you sleep last night? How are you feeling right now? Can I get you some water? Can I get you um, the something to help feel calmer? Do I have music in the background to try and soothe? That's why elevators have that nice calm music because they're trying to calm you down because they know that being in an elevator can be a very stressful situation. If we can help people stay within the window of tolerance, then we're going to be better able to connect with them and help them come up with plans that are going to make sense to them. If they're activated, then we need to take breaks. We need to respond to the activation. Trying to go through that, if you have somebody who is extremely stressed out, extremely activated, and they're agitated, and it doesn't look like they're listening, trying to force your way through that conversation is futile. You're not going to get anywhere. You need to slow down, take breaks, figure out, okay, what can we do differently that can have a better outcome. And so it may be, again, we'll talk about some of those things that you can do for yourself and also what you can do to help your clients. Because if you are activated, if you go into a space and you're activated, then you will be less effective of what you do. There is how long does it take? It's going to be, how long does it take? That's a great question to get deactivated. Um, it can be a reframe that could happen really quickly. Or if they're really spiraling out of control, it may mean having to take some further breaks. It really depends what they come in with. If they haven't had breakfast, if they have a court case that's in the afternoon, and their parking is due in is going to be coming to an end in 20 minutes, which therefore they're going to be likely to get a parking ticket. Um, all of this is going to be playing on their minds. It's going to create an activation because when they're in that distress, they get activated. And so you'll need to address all those issues. Like, we'll have to make sure, let's try, do we need to stop anytime so that you can go pay your parking, put more money into the meter? I mean, that alone can be activating for some. And so if you can address and connect and co-regulate, and neuron mirror is you connect with their activation, and then you help self-soothe or you help co-soothe. You can get there relatively quickly in some situations. In other times, again, you'll need to take more time. It really does depend on the situation. Great question. And I think it depends on asking them about how they're feeling, and they'll do those check-ins. I think you can have little like scaling system on a scale of 0 to 10. How much are you feeling out of control right now? And if you're a 5, how do you get then to a 4? Some of the principles, and this is where I said, like, you can say that you're trauma informed, but are you really trauma informed? And I've developed a checklist, and I'll go through some of that with you later on. But basically, though, you want to ask yourself these questions. Are you giving people choice? And choice doesn't mean, like in child protection, for example, sometimes you have to make the difficult decision of apprehending. But even within that really intrusive act, there's still choice that can be made. So, for example, are you going in with the police and creating further trauma for this family? Or are you in conversations, and say like, you know, I know the substance misuse, I can't just walk away from this. I'm concerned. You're concerned too. You don't want to be the parent using substance in this way. Like, this is something that you want to work with me, and I need to make sure that, your child is safe and that we work on a plan. So, maybe, and I've done this in child welfare. I've said, could you, help this situation? It's a terrible situation we're in. We don't need to make it worse. Why don't you go upstairs and go pack up a little thing, a little suitcase for your child, and be part of the solution. This is not me apprehending your child from you. This is us coming up with a plan to make sure that you get the treatment that you need and to make sure your child is safe. And so so within that, they had the choice of, within that really ugly situation, they still had choice that was theirs in how they wanted to go about dealing with this issue. And so there's always choice. Do you want water? Do you want some snacks? Do you want to go till 10 to 10, or do you want to stop before then? There's always going to be choice. And we're giving them every opportunity we can to give them that choice. Safety, not just physical, but also emotional. So, where people sit in the room. If you are blocking the door, that's going to be potentially threatening to somebody. If they don't feel that they can take a break, that's going to be unsafe to them. And so we want to be able to negotiate issues of safety. And this is, again, where they can bring in their choice. So at what point would I know that you're feeling unsafe? And how do you let me know that you feel unsafe? Maybe there's a code word. Maybe there's something that we're going to talk about ahead of time that's going to make sure that safety is paramount. Empowerment, helping people be making decisions that are in their best interest. I mean, even when I worked in child welfare, my plan was, how do we get it to be that I'm out of your life? You don't want me in your life. I don't want to be in your life because of my mandate. And so how can we start working towards you feeling more empowered to be able to take control of your parenting in a way that makes sense to you? And sometimes you go off script. Like in one situation, the mom said, I want to go back to college. So I said, all right. So I went to the local college and I got the books and I brought it back to mom because she felt really she felt disempowered by the whole experience. And I provided some information, which then that she felt more energized, and then she was able to go to college and carry on and feel empowered in her own life. It's just trying to just facilitate those aspects. Of course, everything we do needs to be trustworthy. and understanding that people in child welfare, perhaps for good reasons, have a propensity of trust that would be more skeptical than neutral. And so we're always looking at what is your propensity of trust? Are you a trusting person or are you not a trusting person? And what goes into that propensity of trust? And for folks involved in the system, they have good reason not to trust us as being professionals because they perhaps have lost a child or their parents have lost a child or there's been bad decisions made previously or they don't feel like they've been heard. And so we're trying to build incremental trust. Vicky and I have talked about this incremental trust building in dispute resolution. And what are like the first steps? What are the calculus-based trust aspects that we could start doing now that's going to help us start building that baseline trust so we can start working together. And then collaboration, we're all a team. We're all in this together. We're all trying to help children. We're all trying to make families and children, safer and more adjusted into communities. And so we need to work together as professionals, which is why, when I had the opportunity to come speak with you all, and there's so many people here from across sectors, I think it's so important to have this cross-sector training. So we're all speaking the same language and we're all addressing issues in a similar way.
So there are several myths in relation to trauma-informed ADR, and we're just going to touch upon a couple of them this morning. One being that trauma-informed only matters for people who've experienced trauma. We know that that's a myth, I should say. It's important to all of us, whether we've experienced trauma or not. Utilizing a trauma-informed lens really helps to recognize the widespread impact of trauma and understanding its potential effects and creating environments where everyone feels safe, supported, and empowered. Another myth is that becoming trauma-informed is really the work of mental health professionals. That too is inaccurate. The onus is on all of us to have an awareness of trauma. And especially those of us in the fields of education, healthcare, social services, law enforcement, every type of workplace. The reality is that trauma impacts individuals across all areas of life, and it's not only the responsibility of mental health workers to work with and support and address the impacts for the people that we work with. The third is that trauma-informed ADR is biased towards those that are traumatized. The reality is that working in a trauma-informed lens really does look at all aspects and trying to make the process safe for everyone involved, including the person who has had trauma in their lives, but also for those who have not. And it's really about being sensitive to everyone that's in the room, regardless of what history they bring to the table. And then there is the myth that trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution is quote unquote soft on interpersonal violence. And I believe, Michael, you were going to touch a little bit on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea here is that if we're being sensitive and empathetic, then somehow being more therapeutic means that we're um, we're allowing too much conversation, we're allowing too much processing, and we're not being tough on issues such as violence. And I think, for example, one of my favorite books is from Ellen Jenkins, who wrote Invitation to Take Responsibility, and is working with perpetrators of violence and how to engage with them within a trauma-informed approach and using a narrative framework to help them identify and then take responsibility, but invite them rather than um, you know shame them or pathologize. Again, we're not condoning the behaviors, but at the same time, we can work with folks in a more humane way. And you know, that's our part of our own biases. We have to figure out who can we or who can we not work with as professionals. And you may have a bias toward working with somebody who's been abusive. Or you may see that as an opportunity because if they've been abusive in one relationship, the likelihood of being abusive in a different relationship is going to be high. And so there's an opportunity of intervention that we can address that violence in a way that is sensitive, but still not being so-called soft on it. And that, you know, the bottom line is that one of the big paramount principles of trauma-informed is safety. Safety needs to be paramount in everything we do because if we're not safe, if it does not appear to be safe in the way that we are providing our services, people's window of tolerance will be activated to either hypo activate, and therefore will be less successful in being able to meet them where they're at.
So we're fully cognizant of the fact that there are barriers to implementing a trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution process. And one of those is training gaps, and that's one of the reasons why we're so very pleased that the PAAC committee has looked at offering a free training to cross-sectorally to a number of individuals who are here today to be able to reinforce the need for such training because of the significance that it plays in the roles of the lives of the people that we work with. There can be resource constraints. Resources cannot just mean financial, but it can be, you know, is there enough time to be able to do this? And you know, people taking a full day today to be here, we recognize that your work still happens in your office, and you're here today learning more about trauma. There can be cultural resistance. The entrenched legal traditions create resistance to adopting trauma-informed approaches. You know, typically the legal system tends to be slow to change, and there can be some resistance to moving from a traditional practice that they're used to in terms of legal systems to one where it becomes more of empowerment. And then there can be systemic issues, which, again, the traditional legal systems tend to focus on efficiency and prioritizing quick resolution. Come on, let's get it done, right? But we all know that those quick solutions, unless they're done through a trauma-informed lens, we're putting band-aids on things. And so are we here to impact change, or are we here to fix a problem for the moment, right? And so it's really important that there's a cultural shift within the system as well.
So some of the work that I've been doing with NCJ, FCJ is around that trauma activation in the courts. It's trying to, first prevent trauma activation. And so this would be the prevention of activation, keeping people within the window of tolerance before they get into those spaces that you are going to work with them within negotiation. So how you do that, you keep things simple, you keep things within an emotional place that is doable. You make sure that the communication, all communication, and if you have an intake, your intake needs to be on board. You know, your first callers, your intake questions need to be trauma informed. I've seen so many intake questions that are themselves activating, where they go into way too much detail about people's traumas, which then makes them feel activated by going through the questions. And so that can then activate them before they even meet you. And so you want to do those check-ins. You want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to prevent an activation, and to address the work with them in a way that is going to hopefully minimize potential activations and be able to call those out as they occur.
Michael, can I just make a comment about that? I
Yeah.
want I want people to think about those of us that are mediators, for example, family mediators, child protection mediators, and the screening process that we use. And the traditional approaches to screening often involves giving people a lengthy questionnaire that has very specific questions. How many times have you been hit? How many times have you been choked? How many times have you been slapped? How many, in the last 6 months, in the last 12 months? And often we're giving those people, either they're being emailed that screening tool, or we're giving them it on a chart to go and sit in a waiting room to fill out. And I really, really hope that as the field of trauma has evolved, so will the evolution of how we do our screening. Because I have never, ever liked that method of screening. I understand why we need to get to the information, but getting to the information to the expense of trauma activation, they don't jive. And so I just want to put that thought out there.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Vicky. And I think where we need to move towards, I'm doing some work in Scotland right now, unfortunately virtually, so I'm not actually there. But it's looking at a differential approach to screening for violence and conflict and trauma. And so what that means is that you start off with a very quick first page, one pager to red flag any concerns, and then if those if that initial screen comes up with any flags, then you would then go into a sit down with folks, and you would do a more intensive, like doing the MASIC short form, or doing whatever tool you decide to use, but that it's you're not giving them too much at the front end that can be potentially activating, that you're really just trying to use your screening to specifically screen for red flags, and then you allow the therapeutic process of ADR to take shape, where you're able to sit down with them and screen in a more empathetic way, because we can have the best tools, but we are the best tool, even though we need like to have we have to have the structure tools, but also we have to be ourselves primed to be able to give these tools in an empathetic way that scaffolds trust and respect, that allows people to feel comfortable enough to disclose, or we run the risk of premature closure and not being able to identify violence because people have just been activated by the questions, and therefore they shut down and they say nothing. So then we get into this respond approach, and this is once there has been an activation. So we're doing everything we can to prevent it, but we know that people will still be activated in the spaces that we occupy because of the past traumas, the generational traumas, the chronic traumas. These are not going to be resolved just because we're more sensitive to the window of tolerance. They're still going to occur, and so we need to be able to respond, and that means, being able to recognize trauma activation. So we're looking at somebody who's now, they're sitting in their seat, and they're starting to get really agitated. They're moving around. They're looking at their watch. Don't ignore those indicators. Acknowledge them, and then look to take breaks to try and provide the opportunity to soothe and to go back into a window of tolerance. And you want to be calm in your approach. You don't want, when you get into a meeting, and where you show up at somebody's house, or you may be going through a lot of stuff in your day too, but it's game on, like it's showtime, and you put on your calm, your calm, open demeanor, and like, hi, come on in, have a seat. And you have to do whatever makes sense for you in terms of your personality and your style, but you really want to make sure that you're not dysregulated, because just like through neuron mirroring, if Vicky is stressed out, I can connect to the neurons that are agitated, that are, that are popping up, and then say, yeah, that's really terrible, Vicky. And then I can help co-regulate and help bring Vicky to a more calm space. But if I'm activated, then I will then pass that on to Vicky, and then Vicky will be even more activated because of my own agitation. So being grounded and being really calm in our approach is so important. And taking breaks that we need to. It's good to take breaks. You may have had to take a break so far today, the time we've been together, and that's just that's okay, and that's good. And promote break time. Like, don't, like, when people are like, we're gonna be here for 2 hours, but don't worry, if you need breaks, we'll take breaks along the way, and we'll take as many as we need, so that they feel that they can always get out of this space if they need to. Clear guidance. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. I just wanted to say, and to expect the unexpected. Even our best efforts won't necessarily uh, minimize or prevent a trauma activation. And I know not that long ago, this was an in-person meeting, and I could see she was becoming increasingly agitated. Her leg was going up and down, and she was kind of moving in her chair. And to try, we can take a few minutes here, and she went into a full-blown anxiety attack. And so it was, all right, let's everyone stop for a moment. Everyone else, please leave the room. All right, let's breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth. We're just going to take our time. Let me get you some water. So even your best efforts can still result in a trauma activation, and be prepared to deal with it when it does. So.
Yeah, for sure. And again, that's like the how to deregulate, or how to calm people down using calming techniques, being more mindful. Let's just focus on our breathing. Let's just focus on the present. Let's just focus on, what is, helping us to be calm in that space. And so you need to do those calming exercises at times, and do those check-ins, kind of get you some water, and just being like there and present.
Okay, so we thought that we would do a little case scenario, and these folks aren't real, so just to be clear about that. With this fact scenario, there's a 21-year-old mom, and she has a 3-year-old daughter by the name of Isabel. And by way of background, Justine was, pardon me, removed from the care of her mother when she was 2 years old. Um, sorry, Isabel was removed from the care of her mother when she was 2 years old as a result of Justine's substance abuse history of relationships with abusive partners, including Isabel's father, and untreated mental health concerns. I'm sure all of us recognize many Justines that we're talking about in the families that we worked with. Justine herself grew up in the care of the Children's Aid Society. At the age of 5, she was removed from the care of her mother as a result of chronic neglect and unsafe living conditions. She had contact with her mother until the age of 7, when at that time she was placed in extended society care. And at that time, her mother just could not handle that anymore, and stopped seeing Justine. Justine grew up in care. She experienced several foster home breakdowns. At the age of 16, like many youth, she left care and lived on her own. She eventually met Isabel's father, who was abusive towards her, and unfortunately, Isabel was witness to the abuse. And Justine is absolutely petrified that her own history of abuse and neglect will be used against her. She feels that she will be seen as an unfit parent. Justine does not want Isabel to grow up in care, and she's fraught with anxiety that she will lose the only person that she loves. Isabel is her whole life and her only reason to live. So these are some questions that for reflection, if we're handling this kind of a situation. How might Justine's own experiences of trauma and foster care impact her ability to parent Isabel? Right? Questions to ask yourself. Another question to ask is, how can child welfare professionals support Justine without reinforcing intergenerational trauma? And then there's the balancing act of balancing safety and reunification. What strategies can be used to ensure Isabel's safety while also working toward family reunification? And then the final factor, the systemic considerations. How might systemic biases, such as assumptions about substance abuse, past trauma, or young mothers, affect decisions in Justine's case?
And when you look at this situation of Justine, and you look at it from a propensity of trust, how much is she going to trust child welfare professionals? Or, I mean, just being involved with child welfare professionals may be itself activating because of these previous experiences. And therefore, she has the likelihood of being labeled as a difficult client or names like a lifer or those types of unfortunate labels that sometimes we give people because we ourselves trying to cope with our own emotional experiences of this work, and it's so challenging. And I've seen in child welfare that people use jokes and humor, but sometimes in a really derogatory way as they try and make sense of this, and that has an impact. And so we need to be sympathetic to the fact that Justine may not want or appreciate our services because they don't trust us. They don't think that we're going to be doing what is right for Justine and Isabel, and probably for good reason. And so we don't want to further blame them for their hesitation to work with us. We don't want to say that there's something wrong with them because they're not being grateful for us being able to, or for our efforts. That we understand that there's a propensity of trust that's going to be marked by a longstanding distrust with the system, and we need to appreciate that coming into this as well.
And I think Michael made reference to a concept that he and I had talked about at another conference, the art of incremental trust building, and that's really reciprocal. It's building trust for Justine, where you're breaking things down into manageable pieces, so she can actually feel some confidence and some support and some trust in the service providers. Uh, that the goal is for reunification, by whatever needs to be addressed. And then also for the service providers, that, once there are measurable goals that can be achieved, then you can move from one stage to the next, recognizing that in particular with substance abuse and misuse, it's not a straight line. It's not a straight journey. There are often going to be ebbs and flows and relapses and whatnot. And so how do you build a safety plan around that while still trying to take into account the ultimate goal of reunification? Because really, that is the ultimate goal, is to reunify families when and if possible.
And going back to that slide around trauma activation, what we don't want to do is uh, have Justine feel re-victimized by the system because her activations are seen as being, pathologizing towards her. Like there's something wrong with you that you're acting this way. Because I would expect, because of the lack of trust of the system, because of the frustration, because of the past traumas, because of the attachment insecurities that there's probably going to be some behavioral, either hyper or hypo-arousing. We don't know how they're going to be reacting, but we can look at this from a trauma-informed perspective and say, yeah, you know what, it makes sense. I'd be fearful of me too if I was you. I would be skeptical of this process as well. I would be. Trying to sabotage it as well because I wouldn't trust it. And so not looking at, sabotaging and blaming and naming and as being indicators of pathology, but looking at it as a reaction to fear, worry, concern. Like the primary emotion of fear and worry and concern then gets picked up into secondary emotions of anger and hostility because they're unresolved. They're ways of trying to resolve the primary emotions, which then gets into those behavior indicators of bad mouthing and sabotaging and so on. And so we really want to go back down to underneath the iceberg to figure out what is really happening here. And these may just be trauma responses that are presenting themselves as being behavioral problems, but really what they are is just unresolved responses to emotions that either consciously or unconsciously are not not sitting well for them. So how to be more empathetic and sensitive in those spaces. I'm going to go through these checklists rather quickly. You're going to have these. This is going to be sent to you, so you'll be able to use these in the work that you do. But they just further, I think, provide examples of how these principles of trauma informed can be put into practice. So, for example, for safety, this would be a yes/no reflection question. So think of the last clients that you worked with. Think of the last mediation or child protection work or the last person, the last client that you've met in your office. Was your setting perceived as safe? And that just not mean like I'm not just talking about tripping hazards. I'm talking even about like if you have a picture of you in Hawaii and you love that picture because you were on this wonderful trip, but you're working with impoverished clients who could never ever get to Hawaii. Are you creating this unsafe environment that there's now a difference between you and them? And so you just look at your space and do like a safety check of your office of what is there, what message is that, what is the unspoken um, uh, narratives of safety that you are promoting in the spaces that you're in. And then, if you did safety assessment, which you should be doing, did you do it in a consistent way? Were you able to explain confidentiality so that they felt, this is all going to be really uncomfortable, and uncomfortable is fine as long as it doesn't get into unsafe. And so you want to make sure that you are, being open and transparent and that you are focusing on their overall sense of safety in these situations. The next one is just trustworthiness. And again, we keep on bringing up this theme of trustworthiness because it's so embedded in trauma informed. It's not articulated that way in the literature, but we think it's so embedded in the way that we think about this work. And so, what is the propensity of trust? And have we been able to create a transparent process? Do we tell them like we're going to meet today, we're going to meet for like 45 minutes, and at the end of that, we're going to then summarize like, are you going to that much openness about your work so that they have an idea of what's to come? The brain says to us that we don't like things that we don't know about. So if you handed me ice cream and said, try this, I'm like, no, I'm not going to try that. What is that? Um, but if you say, "Oh, this is a really good ice cream, and I just bought it from this great store," and you're gonna be transparent about how you got to be that you're handing me ice cream, I may then trust you a bit more to try it and see how it goes. Um, the next one is choice. Again, finding ways that they can have choice. Where do they want to sit? Where do they how long do they want to meet for? Is an hour fine for you, or is that too long? Do you have somewhere to go afterwards? There's all kinds of opportunities that we can give people choice in the work that we do, even if we're in situations where it may be parts of what we do is not voluntary, but even within that involuntary work, there's still a choice to be made even within those. Like I said, go up and do you want to pack something for your kids? Do you want to write a letter? Do you want to, like, what do you want to do? How do you want this to look like? This is what I kind of have to do with my mandate, and I want to work with you and find all opportunities I can for you to have choice within that. Collaboration and mutuality. This is not us versus them. It's really about us together. My very first apprehension in child welfare uh, for us from the hospital, and mom was using really hard substances up until 7 months of pregnancy, and was not in a situation where she had housing or supports in place, and so really there was no other option but to find a place of safety for this infant. But mom gave me a thank you card at the end, which I think really it's got me on the like, oh, this is actually I like this stuff. This is rewarding because said like, this is where we're at right now. And if you go to court, we're gonna go to court in a couple days. And if you have this done, this done, this done, this done, then I'm gonna lose, and you're gonna have your child back. And so I gave her everything that she needed. I worked with her even though we're in a litigation. If I'm losing in court, I don't care. That's about like that's about you being able to win, or us being able to work together to ensure that your child is being cared for. And so think about this work as being more collaborative than us versus them. Again, through all this, how do we empower people? How do we work on their strengths? How do we work on resiliency? Sometimes if we're too trauma focused, we can pathologize, but what we need to be doing is thinking about how do we start building in solutions into this work so people have the agency or feel that they have the agency to make difference for themselves. And so how do they cope? How do they address feelings of unstuckness? And how do we help them feel more empowered, even if they feel that they have limited decision making? How to increase the brainstorming of ideas of opportunities so that we empower them to be part of the solution. And then the last checklist would be the cultural, historical, and gender issues. I mean, I think in all of this work, we need to have a gendered analysis, whether we're talking about family violence, whether we're talking about parenting, whether we're talking about children, relationship with parents. A gendered analysis is important, ensuring that we're not being stuck in gender bias, in patriarchal ways. When I teach about family violence, I like to show Walt Disney clips because it shows how normative these gender biases are in society, and they go unchecked. And it's really important that we are being mindful to our social location and mindful to gender and culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how this all plays into what we're doing.
Okay, so we spent a fair amount of time talking about trauma activation, working with clients. We want to spend the next little bit talking about how this impacts us, right, as helping professionals, and what we are referring to as avoiding the trauma drama. And we all know that working with people who've experienced trauma is difficult and can be emotionally draining. The stories and the situations that we hear about can leave us feeling many emotions, including sadness, frustration, pity, hopelessness, anger, and disbelief. Michael, I'm just going to skip through some of these quickly because we're at 11, just past 11:15 or 11:45, I should say.
Yeah.
Um, So when work, oops, I think this one's Michael's actually, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think we talked a lot about this too already, and so when we talk about the impact of trauma on individuals, we're including ourselves in that. And so again, if we are dysregulated, we're not going to be very good at helping others who are dysregulated. And so ensuring that we're understanding our own experiences is so important. Um, is this me again?
Yep.
Yes. Um, so if you look at the research, and again, if you look at the evidence of uh, the professional's brain, we know that if you are dysregulated, you're going to be helping your clients to be dysregulated. If you come into a session and you put your game face on and you are able to, like, watch a comedy show or do something that is positive, you're going to end up feeling better about things and you're going to end up being able to be more effective. And so don't underestimate your own emotional state when you come into these situations. If you're anxious, your clients are going to feel anxious. If you're happy, your clients are more likely to be more receptive of being positive. I want to be able to separate out burnout from trauma exposure. The word burnout gets used a lot, but burnout specifically means I don't feel validated, respected by my job, by my supervisors, by my organization. And so burnout refers to not being supported within one's work. So you can have trauma exposure and also feel burnout. If you're in child welfare and you're dealing with trauma exposure, and then you're going back to work to your supervisor, you're not getting the support, and they're just giving you more files. Like we asked for more time to work with folks, and they gave us laptops. This is like 20 years ago. I mean, that was like more burnout rather than less. And so it's important to differentiate. Burnout is really about feeling a sense of enemy from the organization, whereas trauma exposure is about what you are exposed to in terms of your work with people who are traumatized, and how you then take that on and it becomes part of you. Compassion fatigue is another outdated terminology that you often hear that suggests that we have some sort of cap of how much compassion we have. Um, and that at some point, then we just stop being caring individuals and we start getting tired into the work. Again, it's not helpful as a concept because is this because of burnout? Is this because of trauma exposure? Is this because we're not taking care of ourselves? Like, what is the idea here? That is, what's the root of this so-called compassion fatigue? And so going too quickly into naming what we think it is can actually be harmful itself. Secondary trauma, vicarious trauma is also an outdated terminology. It suggests that like it's something you catch. That if you're working with folks who are traumatized and you're not careful, it's just gonna it's gonna end up on your clothes or something. And so we want to be careful of the language we use because we don't want to suggest that um, the exposure of trauma is being used in ways that are not helpful in our ways of trying to appreciate how to work from it. So the term that I think makes the most sense and has been given the most recent attention in literature is this notion of trauma exposure response. And the trauma exposure response suggests that as we as professionals go into spaces where people are activated, we then can be exposed to those trauma responses, and then we take some of that in, especially if we are co-regulating and we're meeting where people are at. By doing so, we're gonna have, we're gonna feel heavier because of those experiences, and we need to sort of detoxify ourselves from that trauma exposure by doing self-care.
I think Michael's already addressed some of this. And one of the lines when we were preparing for this training, Michael used, which I thought was brilliant, and I'm just going to share it with you. Um, when we were talking about some professionals being more prone to the impact of trauma, he talked about it as we're running into the fire rather than running away from it, right? So I just thought that was a lovely way of capturing the essence of the work that we're doing. So Michael, just in terms of a time check, we have about 6 minutes left. So do you want to skip to some of the self-care stuff or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if you want to just move these things along, I can just talk about them just to
Sure.
really. So if you look at, again, trauma exposure, again, it's how you feel about yourself right now in the work that you do. If, you may have guilt, there's always going to be these feelings of like, did I do enough? Um, could I have done more? Do I have anything left to give? You have to be really mindful of where you are in this journey of, working in fields where there's lots of trauma exposure, and how are you taking care of yourself? Um, we all act differently. We may be grandiosing, we may be self deprecating, we may be dissociating from the experiences. Uh, this is going to be unique to your approach. Like, what do you do when you're stressed out of your work? We know some people just avoid the work, so they'll stop making phone calls, they'll stop responding to people. They just, and it's like, well, what's wrong with you? No, it's not what's wrong with me. It's that I'm feeling really stressed out, and I don't know how to cope with this feeling out of control. And so I'm just going to disassociate from the work for a bit. And so if you feel you're doing that, then you may be going through a trauma exposure that you need to address. There are many risk factors that make you more prone to being exposed to trauma, including your own trauma history. So we all come at this with our own trauma histories of some kind or other. That's why we use the ACEs, because we know at least 60% of folks. And I would think that if you look at the helping professionals, that probably is much higher in terms of unresolved issues. And we play out these unresolved traumas in the work that we do by helping others. But we need to be mindful of this is our, what's our baggage versus what's their baggage. And so we're not making our issues their issues. And there's many risk factors that you need to be mindful of if you feel overworked, ignoring your own health. Like, when was the last time you've been to the doctor? When was the last time that, you've taken a walk? What are you doing to alleviate these risk factors? And if you don't take care of yourself, then it's like being on an airplane. They say put your mask on first before you help others. And I use that for teaching about parenting. You need to put your mask on first before you help your kids. But we also need to make sure as professionals that we have our masks on first too, because we can't help others if we can't breathe, if we can't regulate, if we can't, neutralize the experiences of trauma exposure. And so being really healthy and in the moment is really important.
I like to refer to, and those of you who are currently taking the child protection mediation main training, I refer to as have your go-to people. Each and every one of us need a network of people around us that aren't our family and friends, but people, colleagues that we can go to when we're feeling maxed out, when we're feeling drained, when we're feeling like, holy moly, this is tough work, right? And to be able to debrief and just talk about some of the heaviness of the work that we're doing. Okay, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're getting to the end here, Vicky. I'm
Yeah.
confident we can get to the very end here.
Okay. Off you
Um,
go.
Again, we're not going to have a lot of time for Q&A, but I want you all to be thinking about how you manage your own exposure responses, and how you can become more informed, and use what we've been talking about today and what you'll be talking about for the rest of the day to help you along in your journey. It's not just one conference that you attend. It's not just one presentation. It's the whole thing. Um, So again, getting the right supervision. Vicky, you talked about, who is your team, who's your, who's people in your support system, and I think that's really important. Finding people who are positive. The one thing that I'll say is, and you just keep on moving to the end of these slides, and I'll just come in. Um, the one thing that we do too often, I think, is really harmful to this work is that we tell war stories. We need to stop telling war stories to each other and tell positive stories, tell strengths-based stories. Like, I had this wonderful case that really worked well, and find people in your support system that you can share positives. Because if you're only getting other folks who are exposed to trauma and they're stuck in that negativity, you will then also become negative. And so the road to recovery is to acknowledge the problems, but also work towards solutions. Like, this is great stuff. What we do, we help other people, and it's wonderful to do that. And we need to be thinking about the positives of this work and making sure that we stay healthy in doing so. So I think we're coming to near the end. Again, these are all things that I think are self-evident. We just have to be reminded all the time. Sometimes you need a watch to tell you, like, move, or something in your calendar to say, like, this is the time I'm going to exercise. Whatever works for you, you got to figure it out. You can actually use ChatGPT. I came up with a whole fitness plan based on my age and my weight and what I wanted to do. I put it all into ChatGPT, and it gave me this wonderful program. So you can use AI to help you out as well. You can put in how to become, what is my road to recovery in ChatGPT, and it will help you.
Oh. Okay, so there are some references here at the end. You will all be getting the materials so that you can make reference to, because I know that we went through some of the slides quite quickly. You're going to see that in many of the references, Dr. Michael Saini is a part of many of the articles that are listed here, because he really is truly a champion as it relates to trauma-informed care and trauma-informed alternative dispute resolution. So maybe we can stop share. I guess I can do that. I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone for listening to us for the last hour and a half. I know that there was a couple of comments in chat about my voice. I'm fine. I had COVID a couple years ago. It's affected my vocal cords, so I'm not sick. I just have wonky vocal cords. So thank you for your concern. Michael, any parting words?
No, it's always a pleasure to work with you, Vicky, and thank you for this opportunity to be with you, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. I feel the same about you, Michael, so it's always a treat to deliver training with you, so thank you.
I think we'll just do like an abundance of thank yous all around. And I know that, like, look at the heart emojis are already coming in, and thank yous in the chat. So thank you both very much for just all your wisdom and experience. I was listening, like, I like those examples of, like, into the fire, we're going into it, because it's like it is easy to wonder if we did enough, if there's anything left we have to give. And there's so much trauma exposure that goes on that we face in this work that we do. So your insights were very meaningful, and it's a reminder of how we can just continue this work while also taking care of ourselves. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Amanda, for your energy.
You're welcome. I love Brendan and the energy. Even early in the mornings, I do that for people.